So I hope everyone who's having tea will join us in a minute, but it's a real pleasure for me to moderate this session. I'm not going to head up there just yet because we have two presentations that will kick off before the panel. First, few words of congratulations to Advocata. I think it's fantastic how they've put economic freedom and liberty on the map in Sri Lanka and on the public policy agenda, but also now put Sri Lanka on the map of Asia's agenda around economic freedom and liberty. And it's a real pleasure for our panel to join this Asia Liberty Forum 2019. As you and I both know, urbanization is one of the defining stories of our region, and certainly this is true in Sri Lanka and as well as in India and other parts of our region. Today we'll be talking about a few of those aspects, given that the urbanization topic is so vast and so wide. We'll be trying to unpack some aspects around measurement of urbanization, gaps in that and what that means for getting governance right and getting economic growth right, getting development and public policy right, but also other questions anchored very closely to the themes of this overall ALF, which is around economic freedom and liberty, and what does it mean, what does urbanization and getting that right mean for economic governance, economic freedom, and topics like that. So I think you have access to the profiles of both Pritika and Iromi, so I'm not going to introduce them. We'll first have Pritika with a 10-minute presentation, followed by Iromi with a 10-minute presentation, and then we'll go up on stage and pose a few questions. I'll pose a few questions to them, particularly bringing Harsha on board to the conversation. But I also ask them to challenge each other and push back and make that dialogue interesting. And of course, then leave a fairly good chunk of time for you to raise your questions to them, taking advantage of having them here with us. So Pritika, over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Pritika Hingorani from IDFC Institute. So we're a think tank based in Bombay, and one of the big areas of our work is urbanization. So I'm going to talk to you briefly about some of the work that we've done in urban, but the idea is to open up the conversation to the challenges that all of us are facing with our rapidly urbanizing cities. You know, it's election season in India, and other than the incidents of the last 2 weeks, the political narrative really has been around what to do about agricultural distress. And so everything that we're hearing is what you do to alleviate, farmer distress and agricultural distress, which is an extremely important concern. But what's interesting is that you hear almost nothing about what to do about urban distress. And this is interesting because, an estimated 70% of GDP comes from our cities, and increasingly GDP growth will happen in cities, but we're not talking about it. And to some extent, this is rooted in sort of a deep-seated narrative that India lives in her villages, right? And that we're a predominantly rural country. Now, it's easy to understand where that narrative comes from, because when you look at the official statistics on urbanization in India, India is predominantly a rural country, and so there's two ways in which we define urban in India. There's a statutory definition and a census definition, and both of those show the country at between 26 to 31% urban. So let me just unpack that for you a little bit more. The statutory definition is essentially a state-level definition. So what this means is that every state government gets to choose which settlements are rural and which settlements are urban. And different state governments use very different criteria to determine this. By this definition, India is just 26% urban. But what's important to note is that when you are statutorily defined as urban, you get a municipal body. The other definition is a census definition. Now, the census definition is a three-part definition that's applied uniformly across the whole country. And it uses three criteria: a population criteria of 5,000 people, density criteria of 400 people per square kilometer, And this is interesting because not many countries in the world use this, but also an occupation criteria that says that 75% of the male workforce needs to be in non-agricultural activities. So when you apply this across the country, India is 31% urban. Now, when you are defined as urban by the census, you don't get a municipal administration. You continue to be governed by a rural local body. And this is important because what urban and rural local bodies are expected to provide are very different. So an urban local body has to put in things like roads and sewerage networks, whereas the rural local body has to look at forestry, some amount of drinking water and sanitation, but not at the scale required at dense urban settlements. So the 5% difference between these two definitions, while that doesn't sound like a lot, in a country like India, 5% is 55 million people, which is pretty much the population of South Africa. So you've got 55 million people that live in areas that are urban, that at the density of urban areas, but that don't have a local government that's mandated to provide them with basic services. So my colleagues at IDFC Institute ran a thought experiment to see if, in fact, India could be more urban than we think. Now, globally, there's no uniform definition of what constitutes an urban area. So countries use vastly different criteria. So what we did was we went and picked two of the most common criteria, and that is a 5,000 population cutoff. So that's, Ghana uses that cutoff, for instance, and the second one was a 2,500 person population cutoff, which is used by populous countries like Mexico and Venezuela. If you use the 5,000 population cutoff, India is probably 47% urban. If you use the 2,500 cutoff, it's 65% urban. Now, we're not the only people that have done this. The World Bank came up with the agglomeration index that uses a host of different factors that suggests that India is 52% urban. Similarly, if you use a density-based definition, it could be 55% urban. So what I want you to take away from this slide is not that any definition is right, or is more accurate than the other, but the fact that how you ask the question about how urban you are gives you a very different answer. Now, let me show you what that looks like at the state level. So look at a state like Kerala, for instance. That's what's highlighted in red. Using the statutory definition, Kerala is just 16% urban. If you use the census definition, it is 50% urban. If you use any of the global definitions, Kerala is 99% urban. So now think of what it means that a state that is perhaps 100% urban is governed as if it were only 16% urban, right? And this has implications for public service delivery, for fund flows, for how you train your bureaucrats, and that's a huge difference. Now, let's stay with Kerala for a moment. Satellite data is a very useful way to look at what's happening on the ground. So if you look at the map on the left, that's the city of Calicut in 1975. The red dots are the built-up area growth in 1975, and the black boundary that you see, that's the municipal boundary. So built-up area growth is contained within the municipal boundary. If you look at Calicut in 2014, however, the city has grown well beyond the municipal boundary, well over the village boundaries and into the surrounding area. Now, this is where I want to open up the conversation to what we're going to discuss later today. This has a host of implications. Most of us in this room believe in markets, and I think what this tells us quite clearly is that, development and markets don't really care about the lines we put on a map. And so really the functional economic unit is all of that, what you see as the contiguous red built-up area growth, but it's governed in very fragmented ways. Now that has implications for public service delivery because like we said, rural and urban local bodies are meant to deliver very different public services. It has implications for productivity as well and the ability to participate in a labor market. So let me just explain that a little bit more. We zoomed in using satellite data to look at roads. Now roads matter because roads, enable mobility. Alain Berthaud at NYU says that we should think of cities as labor markets. So most of us move to cities for jobs. And so a very functional way to think about a city is that it's a labor market. And we see that the larger the labor market, the more productive and innovative it is. So this is where growth is coming from. So our job really then is to maintain mobility within a labor market. What happens though is when you allow this haphazard growth is you have in the municipal part of Calicut, you have road widths of about 9 meters, but in the surrounding areas you have road widths of about 4 meters, right? So it's hard, you can't put in public transit. If you live in any of the peri-urban areas and you access a job in the main area, it's very hard to get to work and back. It's across the spectrum of public goods, access to open space, to housing. And so really what you're doing is constraining economic growth by fragmenting service delivery. We're going to unpack some of this more in the panel, but I will leave you with a question of to what extent are we willing to acknowledge and prepare for urban growth? Thank you.
Thank you, Pritika, for that excellent presentation and for setting the stage. I think her presentation brought up some very important questions around what does it mean to not get this or to be counting it wrong or differently for providing of public services and how we think about growth and development of a city. Segueing into, nicely into that is Iromi's presentation, particularly picking up on a remark that Pritika made around thinking of cities as labor markets, but also this idea of who is the city for, who is occupying this city and what are they using it for, are they able to draw on true freedom to use the city, their city, in the way that they would like. So let's hear from Iromi.
Hi everyone, my name is Yomi Pereira. I'm a researcher based in Colombo. Today I just would like to talk to you a little bit about inclusive growth and about spatial justice when we look at the way we talk about cities, but also about urban governance and economic growth. And there is so much we can talk about on the topic of Asian cities and infrastructure. And what's also fascinating is also the common themes when we talk about Asian cities. This narrative of world-class aspirations, traffic, pollution, climate change, and so on. And when we bring it closer to home in Colombo, there's already so much being said about Colombo. Similar to what Pritika was talking about these obsolete definitions of rural and urban in Colombo or in Sri Lanka, and how that impacts service delivery and resource allocation. So much written about haphazard growth or messy urbanization, or even say take the statistics around traffic. Today during peak traffic hours, we don't travel more than 8 kilometers per hour. And I don't know how many of you have heard this very interesting talk by the former Director General of the Urban Development Authority, Naina Mavilwada, where he spoke about some really frightening statistics around Colombo's traffic, where he said, by the time you are 60, you spend seven and a half years sitting in your car. If you only count the number of hours that you're awake, it increases to 11 years. Or take the statistics around Colombo, the housing in Colombo. There is a severe shortage of housing for middle-income earners. However, if you look at the housing units that are being built over the next 3 years, 51% of it constitutes of high-end and luxury condominiums. The lack of affordability of housing, the lack of affordable housing for middle-income earners is a serious issue that keeps getting highlighted by policymakers and those in the industry. And mainly because of the high price of the housings in the city and barriers to accessing the mortgage financing options, people continue to live in the suburbs or continuing to move further, adding to the traffic and the congestions, so it becomes a vicious cycle. These are common issues across Asia, and I know that we are going to pick up on this later on in the panel. So I want to focus the rest of my presentation to talk about urban development in Sri Lanka with a specific focus on Colombo and looking at it through a lens of spatial justice. And why our approach to urban governance should be inclusive and take into account the aspirations and needs of all demographics. Following the end of Sri Lanka's war in May 2009, the government of Sri Lanka prioritized infrastructure and urban development in its rebuilding process. This was in fact how the government and the BOI, that was sort of the vision they had for Sri Lanka. And conflict-affected areas aside, Colombo was a city that received the most amount of focus with this aim of making it a world-class city. And to carry out Sri Lanka's development plans, urban development was brought under the Ministry of Defense, and a new ministry was created called the Ministry of Defense and Urban Development. Of course, this was delinked under the new government in 2015, and it was brought under the Ministry of Megapolis. The creation of this world-class city basically involves two key projects, as you know: the Urban Regeneration Project, which is carried out by the government, and the Metro Colombo Urban Development Project by the World Bank and the government. Under the Urban Regeneration Project framework, a key goal of urban development is, and I quote, improving underserved settlements in the city of Colombo through private developers and liberate prime lands for commercial activities. Through this process, underutilized urban prime lands will be utilized for development and commercial purposes by the private sector, end quote. There has never been any elaboration about what is meant by underutilized, and a close reading suggests that it means that lands that are not available for private commercial exploitation. Underutilized land in many cases are home to the urban poor of Colombo, who have lived there for generations. Most of them had title to their land, and transferring this land to the private sector raises significant concerns regarding equity. All these new luxury spaces that you see in these hoardings around the city promise, various things: iconic living, the ability to live, work, and play all within walking distance. And as I will talk a little bit about now, this is clearly no longer a luxury that is being afforded to the urban poor anymore. Both the previous Rajapaksa government and the current government see the urban poor as impediments to development and growth. They talk about a slum-free Colombo, but they don't talk about a poverty-free Colombo. If you look at the Megapolis Master Plan, there's a very interesting line in the section about relocating the urban poor, where they say that the relocation of the urban poor is important in order to, and I quote, release the economic corridors occupied by them. So, and what is also really ironic is that according to the government's own data, the communities that are being relocated account for 50% of Colombo's population, and they occupy 9% of the land. So 50% occupy 9% of the land, and we are saying that even that is too much for them. The communities that have been relocated or due to be relocated didn't spring up overnight. We've never had sprawling slums in the way that you see in Dhaka or Bombay. And in fact, CMC data itself doesn't suggest this. It shows that 94% of urban poor settlements in Colombo are what you call permanent settlements. The first series of evictions started in May 2010, and the forced relocations continue to date. And the state's messaging is that we need to move these people in order for them to have, to change their aspirations to a better standard of living. And if you look at the government data, it shows that they are moving anything between 280,000 people to 500,000 over the next few years to the outskirts of the city. I don't know how many of you are aware that these kinds of buildings are actually now kind of steadily being built in the north of Colombo. Life in the high-rises is hard, and I've been working in these communities for years, so I've seen them deteriorate into vertical slums over the years, increasing insecurity for women and children in particular. Each household has to pay 1 million rupees over the next 20 years in order to receive title, and this is irrespective of whether you owned your house before or not. So you can actually have an asset being taken away, being forced into one of these apartments, and then being asked to pay another 1 million rupees in order to receive title. There's also a restriction on these houses. Even once you receive title, you can't sell, rent, or mortgage your apartment. So as you can imagine, people are experiencing huge amounts of debt due to increased expenses and loss of income. The policy is also a house for a house, which means that if you lived in, say, a 2-story house with 8 members, you are still entitled to only one 400 square foot apartment. Of course, this has changed a little under this government. The apartment size has been increased to 500 square feet. But as you can see, the balconies have been taken away because they like this aesthetic of uniformity and they want everything to look the same from the outside. But what does this mean in practicality? It means basic things like people can't do their laundry anymore in the balcony. They have to basically do their laundry like this in the public spaces. And this has a huge burden on women in particular, women who have already had to give up a huge amount of time and time for income generating activities in their new apartments. People also receive huge water bills, sometimes amounting up to even 10,000 rupees a month. So you can imagine the kind of burden that the urban poor has to pay to make way for these liberated lands. Just to come to the financing of all of this, the UDA raised 10 billion rupees through a treasury-backed debenture in 2010. The Ports Authority, Bank of Ceylon, Sri Lanka Insurance Corporation, Ceylon Bank, Commercial Bank, Sampath Bank were some of the local investors. However, the failure of the envisioned financing model, coupled with allegations of large-scale corruption, resulted in the government issuing another 10 billion bond to pay local and foreign investors who subscribed to the 2010 UDA debenture. These apartment complexes are bleeding the UDA dry. People aren't paying rent and utility bills, and the UDA doesn't even have money to fix the lifts when they are broken. So more often than not, you see people having to climb up and down 12 floors on a daily basis. And this situation will continue until phase 1 is over, which means that when the UDA has finished building the 15,000 apartments of the first phase, which I think they're close to completing, at some point this year, Beijing-based Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank will come in to begin phase 2 of the URP and work with the UDA to build the remaining 50,000 apartments, a $280 million investment over a 5-year period. To end and to come back to our topic today on challenges and opportunities across Asian cities, I believe spatial justice has to constitute a key component in the way that we talk about our policies, the way we construct them, and the way we think about our cities. We get so caught up thinking about, talking about infrastructure and traffic and roads, we no longer see cities as living things. And who are we building this world-class city for? Who's going to get to use it? Who's going to benefit from it? Especially considering what price we are paying for it. Land value cannot always trump land use. We can't continue this cycle where land price is so high. The only way investors can make a profit is to build luxury developments. But at the heart of all of this is political will. We are always stuck in 5-year election cycles, and which means that we are committing to long-term 40, 50-year projects, but want to see tangible, visible 5-year results. And all of this at a great economic cost. We need to, and to end, something I just want to leave you with is that we need to look at cities as a big jigsaw puzzle where unless all the pieces are accounted for, and all these pieces also include the middle class, the urban poor, the informal sector, this puzzle or this world-class city is never going to be complete. Thank you.
Thanks, Iromi. We'll pick up on some of the themes. In particular, I'd like to get into with both Iromi and also Harsha later on about this, the coercive nature in which the state can act in order to unlock some of these lands, taking away fairly certain ownership rights that they had. And it's important to remember that a lot of these weren't actually slums, as you would often imagine. These were houses with title. And also around questions around fixing issues, whether it's infrastructure or housing, what's the role of the private sector? The UDA, yet another public sector institution that just has taken on too much. Whereas, why couldn't we have looked at other financing models, bringing in the private sector that could have arguably delivered quicker, faster, and a more sustainable project? So a debate to get into. I won't take too long, so let's move up on there, and I'd like to ask Minister Harsha de Silva also to join us on stage. So I'll pose a couple of questions initially to our panelists and then quickly open it up to the audience. I know we are running a little bit. Okay, perfect, thank you. So Harsha, diving straight in, could you give your reflections on some of the things you heard, both around what counting and measuring what it means to be urban means for governing, and particularly drawing on your experience representing a constituency in this city, an urban constituency, what that means in terms of delivering effective public services, but also more broadly, so that is more conceptually, but more specifically rather around Colombo and our cities here in Sri Lanka. What are your thoughts on some of the key challenges facing us in dealing with infrastructure issues, justice issues, property rights, as well as this idea of who are the cities for and how that affects competitiveness of our cities. So I know it's a lot. We'll try and unpack a few, but initial remarks from you.
Thank you. Thank you, and once again, I think I join Anushka in congratulating Advocata for having been able to organize this and get people from around the region to come here. I hope you'll have some time after this 2 days of intense academic work to take some time off and look around Colombo and this country. I agree with you that there are issues of definition, and it is not just in India but here as well. At least in India you have a municipal sort of definition and a census definition. But we don't have a census definition as such, but I think we have an administrative definition, which is like a municipal definition. And in Sri Lanka, the way in which we define urban using various parameters, I think we are still about 20% urban and 80% rural, which in my mind is completely nonsensical. Because even the electorate that I represent, which is the national capital, place called Sri Javadanapura Kotte, the edges of it is actually Pradeshiya Sabha, meaning village council. And we have high-rise condominiums in village councils. It can't really happen. So there is a fundamental problem in defining. So I agree with you that we need to be more realistic in defining these areas, because like you very correctly pointed out, the issue is with policy. So if you have a 99.9% urban Karnataka, sorry, it was not Kerala, and that is what the reality is, but it's only 15%, then your policies are all going to be rural-based and agriculture-based, whereas it should really be urban-based and, things like that. So we need to resolve that. And resolution of that then helps policymakers like myself to be able to better plan how to spend, scarce tax money. coming to Iromi's sort of rather critical comments, I'm going to disagree with her on one thing, and she said that forced evictions continue to happen. And I'm going to disagree with you on that, because you and I both fought in the Supreme Court. We intervened some, 5-6 years ago. And I, for one, have ensured, at least in areas that I represent, and that we do not evict people forcibly. And just to give you an example, where we have been trying to release some economically valuable land, and again I disagree with you on that, because land is valuable, and if land is being used by, if it is 8% of 9% of land being used by 50% of the people, why are we living in the city? Is it not possible to live just outside the city and commute to the city? Or else can we build better housing so that it takes only 2% of the land, and we have that much more land available for economic activity? Because if you are occupying valuable land, then the efficiency of that land, productivity of land is that much less. So therefore, I don't agree with you on that. And what I was saying is to evict a certain area, it has taken us almost 3 years. Velupulavatte, you might be knowing, right? It started some time back. So we want to make sure that each person is taken into consideration as a person, as a family. And for instance, sometimes when we evict people with 8 members in the family with a 2-storied house, we are giving them 2 500 or sometimes 3 500 square foot apartments. So this, I know we can perhaps offline debate this matter. But I do agree with you on your spatial justice argument that you are making, but with the caveat that just because people have lived in a particular area and that moving away from that area cannot be an alternative, even though that area is going to be that much more productive if the use of that land was economic as opposed to residential. And just to...
yeah, Harsha, just on that, I wonder whether one of the reasons why there have been concerns around what it means to unlock that for better economic value has been questions around transparency for the purpose or the investor or the firm that those projects were unlocked for. Is that part of the reason? I know this was done under a different, at a different time, different government. Is that part of the reason that's driving these question marks around under what process was this taken and who is getting it? Were those deals transparent? Did the public get the best deal here? Did the investor get the best deal?
No, it is in nothing. It is about property rights. I mean, this is what you guys are here to talk about. It is property rights. That's a fundamental issue. So every person, does he or she have title to this land? Right? Do we have a transparent way in ensuring that we can look at the land records and cadastral registers and registration of or surveying these plots? That we have 1 million plots that still need to be surveyed and registered. Right? When that doesn't happen, there are rent-seeking people in various places that then perhaps get together with developers and maybe corrupt politicians or whoever else they may be, and sort of pass on the bad deal to the folks who are occupying the land and the good deal to the developer that comes along. So unless and until we resolve the real issue of title deed and property rights, are vested with those people who are occupying the land, then we don't have a solution until we do that. So something that our government is really trying hard to do is to give these people a freehold title. A lot of these land, a lot of the properties that people have, they don't have freehold title. They have some sort of title, but it is worthless because you can't take it to the bank.
Yeah.
So the issue is some politician at some point said, look, these guys are not fit enough to make their own decisions. And it goes beyond urban land. It is particularly an issue with rural land where people are farming and they have 2.5 acres of paddy land which cannot be sold, which has really no value. So unless you get your property right transferred to you, your title deed transferred to you, you can't really deal with this issue, because I believe each individual person has his or her own ability to decide as to what he or she wants to do. The government can, have policies, regulations, but the government shouldn't be telling people, look, this land is for you to cultivate and never to be sold and to be given to your elder son and stuff like that. So that's how I see it.
I want to bring in Pritika and Iromi also on some of these topics, but also a couple of others. But before I do, a tangential point to this, Harsha, is the question of bringing in the private sector to deliver some of these infrastructure needs in the city and in this city and in other cities across the country. That has been very slow to take off. Whether it's questions around urban housing, where PPP structures could have been worked out, whether it's around infrastructure. You talked about why won't some more of these folks move further out. The fact is, that affects their ability to access labor markets, given the cost and time that it takes to commute in. So then on transport infrastructure. So we really haven't seen the opening up of this for private sector activity, and we've seen continuously the government trying and failing often to deliver these good intentions to begin with, but then saddled with unrealistic, unprofitable projects.
Well, I agree with you that for this to be sustainable, you have to have the transport piece put in. So without the transport piece, then it becomes difficult for private enterprise to come in and offer reasonably priced accommodation away from the city. So that is why we will start Sri Lanka's first light rail transit, which will have 6 lines, green, blue, yellow, etc., starting this year, with the line coming from Battaramulla to Fort.
But even
so
that's with a loan.
Fort.
Even that's with a loan as opposed to a PPP
well,
structure, right?
I mean, there can be different financing options. It is very difficult for investor to put in the kinds of billions of dollars that needs to be put in to build light rail unless they have access to real estate along that path, so that you can have right of access, right of way, and you can build malls and you can build housing complexes and things like that. So there is gap financing that is required, and we are looking at different models. The loan is for the first Japan-funded project from Battaramulla to Fort, and we believe there will be others who are interested in that.
On the housing piece, also a private sector coming in?
Yeah, so I mean, just yesterday's papers, I read an advertisement that just outside this hotel, the starting price was $1.2 million. And they are selling apartments here, ITC apartments. I don't know if it is true, but they said the penthouses were at $15 million US, right, here in Colombo. So at 1.2, this is the targeting, I don't know from where these people are going to parachute down from, but they must be having some sort of game plan, right? And so that is one amazingly rich bunch of people who are going to come there. But if you look at the other end of the spectrum, private investors are unable to build and sell at a profit. No private business can operate without making reasonable return. So that is why the government is saddled with building low-income housing. So I don't know in other countries how private enterprise has been able to successfully integrate into building low-income housing, but it hasn't really worked here. The only one that has, to an extent, worked is the Tata housing, where they moved the people who were living in that area where they are going to build luxury apartments just across the new buildings. But, you know, you and I may disagree on this again, but I think they're not very pleasing. You know, in the heart of the city with nice glass buildings, you have this yellow and blue thing coming, and it has kind of disturbed the views. You might call me elitist or whatever. I'm not. I'm just saying, right? I mean, we build this city, you know, it's going to have to be pretty also. So the reason is that the business model does not yet exist. And there are several reasons for it. You may not think about it this way, but things like duties on steel and duties on sanitary ware, which is at 100% and so on, makes housing that much more expensive. And we have threatened to remove these para-tariffs. We have successfully been able, or rather we have been partially successful, and I'm certain that in the budget next week you will see more of these para-tariffs coming off, but that's the way that you can make housing at least affordable to young people to start life. So that's my thing.
I'm going to turn to the audience, give you the chance to pose some questions. If you guys are okay with it, I'll take a few, cluster them in, and if you have any thoughts around some of the things Harsha said, you can bring that in as well in your responses. So we have the gentleman here and the lady over there. Can we get a mic, please? Sure. Up here, please. First row, yes.
Okay, thank you. My name is Zia. I'm representing a Prime Institute from Pakistan. We're working on urban economies. My question is with the panel. As far as the cities in the South Asian region are concerned, what I understand, there is a lack of democratic accountability on city level. Our municipalities are not empowered. So it means that who's the driver? The driver is either the federal government or the state government. So unfortunately, if they are getting the votes not from that city and they're getting the vote from the country, so they have the incentive goes down. The lady is saying that 50% population is living on 9%. And we have seen in my country also similar. So what is important, if we look at the list of the livable cities in the world, most of these livable cities has very empowered municipalities. Then only they were able to work out. Because if you are in Colombo, a city of about 0.6 million or 0.8 million, whatever the population is, if the mayor is empowered here, and that mayor has to develop a development plan which will be as per the more citizen friendly, because he has to go into that electoral process. The problem is this, that whether the federal government or in all these countries, will they be ready to give or devolve power, because devolution of power is not a voluntary process.
Great question, and it's something that I'd like to bring you in as well on Pritika's. Can we get the mic to the lady there, please? Back further up. If you can raise your hand. Yeah, great, thanks.
So this is something I practically know, because I live in Bambalapitiya flats. I think the minister knows that there had been several proposals over the years to demolish the Bambalapitiya flats and to build an apartment complex. Now, being residents in these flats, we have been informed from time to time, and we have been given plans that they will be building a 60-floor building. And another time they said, no, it's not 60 floors, we have changed it, we are going to build 2 buildings with 30 floors. Now, my concerns with regards to this is, now, Minister, we know that when essentially, now, according to these plans, the first few floors are allocated for commercial purposes. Now, according to the 60-floor plan, it was the first 15 to 20 floors allocated for commercial purposes. Now, one concern is that as I know, as per my knowledge, that when we move higher above the ground level, the value of the houses tend to decrease. So, they say anyone who has 3 bedrooms, okay, will be getting 4 bedrooms. So will it compensate for the value of the house that we currently own?
Okay.
Another concern for me is that...
Is there a question? Could you maybe frame it as a question? Because we need to get few questions.
Yeah, the question is whether is the value of the houses, value of the current houses taken into consideration when allocating houses in these complexes.
Understood.
And also, these complexes consist of centralized gas systems, security. So, do the people who already own a house now, who will be reallocated to these complexes, will they have to pay those expenses as well, which is going to be increase into their living costs?
And I'll bring you, Iromi, on that also to reflect on some of what you've seen.
And,
I'm sorry, we need to move on to get a few more questions.
Okay,
and
that's all right.
any further questions, make sure Harsha can't leave until he answers those outside. The lady here in the second row had a question as well.
The second speaker described people being moved into flats where they had to pay to own the flat, but they couldn't sell it and they couldn't rent it. What do they own?
Good questions. Could we take maybe one more, if it's not too much for the panel? From this side? Yes. Professor HD.
Hello, thank you very much for nice presentations. I'm H.D. Karunaratne from University of Colombo. My basic question is about that Sri Lanka. We do not have statistics definition. We are still having this only one definition where urban means only municipalities and urban councils. So in that case, we are having only 18% population as urban. So I don't know how long we are going to continue that. Why can't we formulate a statistical definition at least to explain, because with our per capita income level, we can't say 82% of Sri Lankans are living in rural area. So I don't know why we are not taking this reflect the Sri Lankan institutional failure and policy failure.
Right.
So when can we take the steps to do that?
So I think some very good questions stemming from some of the things you talked about, but also others. Let's do it like this. Pritika, I'd like you to answer two things. So the first is around this, the closest unit of government and governance likely to deliver the most responsive public service, and why haven't we empowered this unit, and the tension between that local unit versus the rest, right? The second is kind of reframing that last question. Would be, after you wrote that article with Ruben around India being a country of cities and not villages, what has the response been in terms of changing it? So what happens next? Has it been, and what suggestions would you have to move forward to actually get some of these definitional and measurement changes done, given how decisive it is in terms of getting public service delivery recalibrated? So those two particularly. Harsha, I'd like you to reflect on, given that I think the DCS comes under you, right? Yes. So because you have the power to try and change some of these definition and measurement issues, responding to Professor Karunaratne's question around, is there a plan to do something about it? Can we do something? How long that will take? And I'm not sure whether it's entirely fair to pose the question around the specific housing project to you, given that housing is not necessarily under your purview, but feel free to respond a bit to that. Iromi, I think the lady who asked the question, her surprise around what do they then own, what are they getting for that 1 million, why did they lose title that they had initially, and some of the problems around that. So I'll start with Pritika.
Okay, so to your question on political representation, couldn't agree more. And this is a point that we've been making, and it's clearly the case all across South Asia, which is you need directly accountable government at the city level. Now, the slightly cynical answer to that, why it hasn't happened. So in India, there was the 74th constitutional amendment that said, you're meant to devolve power to urban local bodies. That's happened to varying degrees. And, the reason that it's probably not happened is because if the mayor of Bombay were directly accountable, they suddenly become more powerful than the chief minister of Maharashtra, right? Because I think, again, it's something like 60 to 70% of Maharashtra's GDP that comes from cities. So what you'll see is very often that the chief minister actually holds the urban development portfolio. So it's clearly that power struggle. I think as we if we devolve more power to local bodies, there's two things that are very important to fix. The first is building up capacity. So when you look at municipal government in India at least, there's less than 1% that's actually making decisions, and about 99% tend to be low-skilled workers. And that's a problem we have with the structure of government. And so I think building capability to deliver on what you're expected to deliver as a local government is important. And also streamlining. Over the years, there's been a lot of overlapping jurisdictions. The state government keeps creating different authorities to deliver different services, so bus services, electricity, water, and we really need to create a streamlined structure. How we get there sort of goes to your question as well. A further compounding problem has been political representation. So electoral boundaries in India have been frozen until 2026, which means that constituencies that urbanize rapidly obviously have more people, but they get the same vote as another constituency that has fewer people. And so really the best way for this transfer of power to happen is from a sort of electoral pull, people saying we want you to care about our cities, but the urban voice is systematically underrepresented. So so how we get there, I don't know, but we're trying our best as well. To your question, so the response to the article that we wrote, and we've been making this point now for a couple of years, has largely been positive. I think people can look around them and say that we're definitely over 26% urban. Some of the response, and this is a response you get all over the world, is stop developing larger cities and develop villages so people stay there. And I think it's very important to note, and you can go back through decades of development literature. Developing villages has never kept anybody in a village. You have to recognize that people have aspirations and they're going to move if they want to move. And so I think the question, we really have to pivot the question to what do you do to then enable cities to function better? So what we've done to push the agenda is just try and write as widely as we can. The Ministry of Finance publishes something called the Economic Survey of India. So we got this work published there. We're making a series of videos. We're talking widely about it to policymakers and others to just say that we really need to change the narrative that cities are somehow evil and taking away from the countryside. So I think there's things to fix on several fronts. There's research, there's advocacy, there's a political pull that needs to be fixed.
Thank you, Pritika. Harsha, particularly on the measurement. Okay, sure.
To answer your question, I think that's what the communities who are affected ask themselves every day. What is this all for? Because it wasn't a choice. It was an involuntary movement to these apartments, leaving behind an asset that they had. And more often than not, and the statistics support it to say that they were permanent, which means, permanent walls, they had roofs, they had a floor. So you've spent years, and in most cases, decades and generations, building up this house. Sometimes it's more than one floor, sometimes it's 2, 3 floors. And then that asset gets taken away. All your life savings, all of it is gone. But it also includes state investment, municipal council investment, NHDA, Ministry of Housing investment, to improve the roads, give water connections, give electricity connections. All of that is erased. And then you are moved to these apartments and then told, you have to pay this 1 million, you have to pay your utility bills, and eventually you get title, but until then and even after that, you can't move. And the rationale behind this is very simple. The Urban Development Authority doesn't want the people to go back and recreate their slums, and these are things that they tell us. They'll say, look at what's happening in Bombay, you give them houses, they'll always come back. But then put mechanisms in place to ensure that people don't come back. There's a reason why people move. There's a reason why people leave these buildings or don't feel at home. So take all those things into consideration. And I think that is really what is at the heart of what I mean by special justice. And just to address something that Harsha said before about the Tata housing, I'm totally on board with you. It's not an elitist comment. Those apartments are very ugly. Imagine how the people of Java Lane feel about having to go and live in them. They are surrounded by Tata, by Cinnamon Life, by Destiny Mall. Beautiful buildings. The hoardings talk about the epitome of 7-star living. And then in the middle, you have these 500-600 apartments coming up, and they are so ugly. Imagine how it feels to live in them when you yourself had a beautiful house. It may have been a small house, but it was your house, and it was a beautiful house. There were 500 families, all with title. And Tata is not building them housing out of the goodness of their heart. They, in fact, wanted to move the Java Lane community, all 500 families with title, to these apartments in North Colombo, 7 kilometers away. They went to court, and it was a court said, no, you have to give them in-situ housing. That's the only reason why Tata is building housing there. And then what did they decide to do? They built the ugliest building they could think of in the middle of all of this. Imagine how the people feel. And this is what I mean about spatial justice. It's not about being elitist. It's about all of us having a piece of that pie that everyone's calling a world-class city.
Yeah, I mean, this goes to the very core of capitalism and, what you guys are here to talk about. Can everybody get the glass panel $1.2 million homes? You can't. That's the reality. If you have $1.2 million, you can get one of those houses. If you don't, you get what you get, right? So then the government cannot give these guys, whoever it is, houses that are more expensive. I don't know what you mean by that. So you want those apartments not to be built, or to be built, or for them to stay there, or to be moved somewhere else, or what is the solution? So if you're going to build a house for $4 million, right, and if that was the value of the house, right, then they're going to get a house of $4 million. And how much of space will 4 million rupees get in Slave Island versus how much will 4 million square feet will 4 million get in some other place, right? So you said it was their house. Yes, it was their house. This is their house too, right? So, as a policymaker, I got a problem because people come and ask for houses from me, and I tell them, how can I give you houses? You better work, make some money, build a house. The government can't give you houses. And a lot of these places that people have occupied, I know for a fact that they have gone and encroached, and over the years, the law says if you stay for 20 years or 15 years or 5 years, then you have some sort of ownership right to it. So this is a problem that is complicated, right? It is, why I say complicated, is you have answers, but not straightforward answers, right? And there is no way in which you're going to make everyone happy, right? So justice in this instance, you see, must be done, but whether you're going to be utterly delighted with what you get is another question. Now look at the Pakistan development. You know, the Destiny. I mean, they are struggling to complete those 200 houses. They are following the same Tata model. I am really worried now if Tata is going to put the ugliest houses they can ever think of there, what Imperial is going to put on the other side of that development, right? So it is a tough one, but what I'm trying to say is we cannot please everyone. You know, we're going to have to, you know, make some decisions and free up. I mean, I'm not saying what you call forcibly evict, right? That is not on. You know, we have to give everybody their equal rights. But we have to utilize the land and make maximum productive use of that land. And your question on the definition, yes, suddenly the Department of Census and Statistics landed on my table. We have had some discussions, and I'm going to be working on some amendments to some of the definitions. And also something that I might share with you is to amend the law that governs the Department of Census and Statistics for data to be shared more than what is currently being shared. Because the DCS tells researchers, this is my data, don't come near my data, I will not give it. So, you know, there are some of our former analysts who are working on this, and we hope to bring in some sort of legislation for data sharing.
We have just a couple of minutes, and I'm very happy to throw it back to the audience. If you have any questions, zooming out a bit from Sri Lanka, but also zooming out a little bit on the topics of housing and also measurement. Is there anything else that you haven't heard in today's session that you know, you're burning up inside and you really want to want to articulate that or challenge some of the things that were said? Ravi?
Just a very quick comment. I think the fundamental issue with all of this is the core of the liberal order, which is property rights. So you can't really take anybody's property through coercion unless it's voluntary given at market price. There's also Hernando de Soto's thesis on formalizing informal property rights, where you give proper title to people who have been occupying land. They live there, so you give them proper title, and then if there's a need for development, to buy it out. So a possible approach for the government to take is to ensure formalize a lot of and standardize all property rights, which is also a very populist move, which will get you votes for the upcoming election. And if you do it across the country, because the same problem of displaced people in the north who are fighting for their one policy on property rights can cut across the whole lot and solve a lot of problems, get you a lot of votes, and leave everybody better off.
Can always count on someone from Advocata to end with very interesting public policy suggestions, including why it makes political sense. We're lucky to have Politician here taking time to be with us, and I hope some of these ideas get taken forward. He's certainly one minister who has the appetite and the willingness to do it. Unfortunately, we have to close. Thank you very much, Pritika and Iromi, for bringing in two very different aspects of this urbanization debate. But I think, I'm sure I'm speaking on behalf of all of you, I certainly have many more questions at the end of this than I started with. And you may also. I'm sorry if I didn't have time to go into all of those, but they will be around for a little bit, so catch them and get all your queries answered. Thank you very much for having us at this session at ALF.